Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. Let's go live. No intro music today because that takes a little bit of extra setup. I'm here with Alex Palacio. He is the author of The Turquoise Serpent, Ashes of the Urn, Part 1. Part 2 I know is on the way here eventually, so I already have that linked in chat if you guys want to check that out. This is a very interesting book. I actually haven't read it yet because I'll be honest, I just don't get to read everybody's books. But this is a fantasy tale, but in a more of a Mesoamerican setting, which to me is much more interesting than what I tend to see a lot of, which is, including what I write, which is very European influenced kind of stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with the European influenced stuff, but I also like journeys outside of our, I guess, Eurocentric norms. How you doing, Alex?
Hey, David. I'm doing really great. Thanks for having me on the show. Thanks for inviting me on. I know it was kind of a last-minute thing, but yeah. I was more than happy to jump in and say hi to the people because I watch your show all the time. I really enjoy it. So
yeah, fun that's live. So maybe we'll get him on next week. He's doing Kyrie Part 3. I have the first two and the additional books. It's one of the graphic novels that I'm actually really willing to buy because it's Roman. It's not cape shit, you know. It's not superheroes. It's Roman history and like heists in Roman history. It's very unique. So I like unique voices and unique stuff. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your book before we just jump in to talk about whatever?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, my book it's fantasy. It's kind of Conan the Barbarian derived sword and sorcery, kind of by way of a little bit of Jack Vance and Gene Wolfe in terms of my influences, and I kind of distilled that as, you know, to the extent I'm capable, and put that into, as you noted, a Mesoamerican sort of Aztec Mayan influenced setting, and that setting I think has been really fun to write in and worked out for a book that people seem to have enjoyed a lot because it's unfamiliar. I think that's kind of one of the benefits to that. As you mentioned, there's that European derived setting is sort of the default, and I also love it and have no issue with it at all. But you know, I come from the desert Southwest, so kind of looking a little bit south to see the Aztec stuff and the Maya stuff was a lot of fun, and a lot of that. A lot of people, I think, don't realize the depth and how absolutely insane those cultures were in a lot of their imagery and iconography and practices. So it's fun to get to kind of, you know, build that into a sword and sorcery. Not that Robert Howard did not do that himself, because he did, right? Like Red Nails, one of the later, I think maybe the last Conan story that was published during Howard's lifetime, is highly derived from kind of the American Southwest Hopi substrate that kind of gets put into maybe a little bit more of an Aztec setting once Conan finally gets to the lot there with Valyria.
Yeah. What I love about the, you know, what do we call it? Hyboria? Whatever. Conan setting is that it's really vehicle for Robert E. Howard and I guess the pastiche composers that followed him to just kind of put whatever setting into play. There's points where like Conan's a pirate, you know, everything's kind of helter-skelter as far as its consistency, but that's what makes it fun because each individual adventure you don't quite know what you're going to get. You might get a new layer of the story, and I would say even with you know, Robert E. Howard, the setting itself is not particularly Eurocentric. It's really quite unique. It feels like maybe ancient Bronze Age Mesopotamian stuff at times, especially if you're looking at like the Kull stories, Kull, Exile of Atlantis, which if you're listening to this and you've never read any Robert E. Howard, it's a good time to read Robert E. Howard. I actually recommend starting with the Kull stories before you do the Conan stories. I like to read I'm a fan of not chronological order, but rather publication order, rather than chronological order. you get a different feel for how the artist is developing the ideas. So I'd read Cole, and then the last Cole story is called By This Axe I Rule, and that becomes the Phoenix on the Sword. It gets rewritten into the first Conan story, and then you can read all the Conan stories and see how they develop from there. The Cole stories have a really interesting atmosphere, and it's really cool to see how it develops into the Conan stories. These kind of magical, mythical, ancient serpentoid beings that are beneath the surface, acting against the regular people and the mechanisms of civilization. There's a lot of interesting layers there.
Agreed. And in fact, that was one of the things that really struck me, because I did not read the Cole stories first. I read the Conan stories first, and then went back to read Cole and was struck by how different of an atmosphere he was writing. And part of that was how it was more focused on sort of like the strange and magical elements of, proto-Earth, even than Conan was. And there were some Conan stories that did go into depth on that stuff, like the Scarlet Citadel, has a lot of wizardry and eldritch horrors and stuff like that in it. But it's much more consistent, I think, in the Cole stories, and definitely affects that atmosphere.
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, that's my recommendation, because I think it's really cool to see how a writer develops. And if you've read maybe a smattering of them, I think it's good to go back and read the Cole stories. As time goes on, I tend to have even more affection, I think, for those than a lot of the Conan stories, because of their weirder atmosphere, the darker approach. It's more experimental. Robert E. Howard was a guy that would just try out different things and kind of see where he could go with them and see if he could get them published. He wrote a huge variety of different things. We tend to think of him as the writer of Conan. Maybe people think of him as Solomon Kane, but he wrote horror. He wrote in every genre, really, that you could write pulp in. There's a lot there, and you could feel those threads kind of working their ways into what would be, today we would call Conan fantasy, but there's really strong horror elements in almost, I'm not going to say every Conan story, but in a large portion of them, there are strong horror elements, and I think that's what makes them more effective. There's like a horrible threat. We really feel like things are going to turn out badly.
Definitely. The and that's sort of where he does cross over so effectively with the H.P. Lovecraft stuff.
Yeah.
As you know, they were good friends.
Yeah, they were friends and pen pals. I often wonder, if Robert E. Howard had lived longer, how much bigger would he be? I think of like the giants. When I think of like the giants of popular literature, this is a weird thing, and I've mused about this on the channel multiple times. There's a disconnect between what people read and enjoyed and what is taught in schools that you should read or enjoy, like what's important, quote, important. You're never going to find a literature class that makes you read Robert E. Howard. You're probably never going to find a literature class that makes you read Edgar Rice Burroughs. But if you want to know where genre fiction came from, especially fantasy and science fiction, you really have to read those authors and H.P. Lovecraft. Those are like the three guys that you have to read. Really, Edgar Rice Burroughs is probably the most influential writer that ever lived, if I stop and think about it. Is there anyone that had a bigger influence on literature? I can't think of someone. Yet he's not taught in schools at all.
No, not at all. I recently wrote about that on Twitter too. I mean, not in the Edgar Rice Burroughs context, but in the H. Rider Haggard context. Similar writers like Rudyard Kipling does get read occasionally in schools these days, but Robert Louis Stevenson is another who does not. And Stevenson and Haggard were both, highly influential on, not maybe as influential, universally influential on all genre the way that Burroughs is today, but certainly there were titans in their own day who nobody reads She anymore. Nobody reads King Solomon's Mines. The last gasp of H. Rider Haggard was that League of Extraordinary Gentlemen movie, as recycled through the sort of edgy deconstruction of it in the graphic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really been no mention of Alan Quatermain since then.
Yeah, this is like classic adventure fiction. Robert Louis Stevenson as well. And also, who wrote the Natty Bumppo books?
Oh, shoot. I'll never remember.
Oh my gosh.
That wasn't Sabatini, was it?
James Fenimore Cooper. It's like Last of the
Fenimore
Mohicans. Oh gosh, all of them, right? I haven't read them in so long, but these are really classic adventure stories that are almost never taught. So if you, and I think about this every once in a while, and it's strange and frustrating. But, I studied literature at the university level. Of course, everybody goes through high school. We never got to a point where, like, okay, we're going to read romantic period literature. We never read Sir Walter Scott. We never read James Fenimore Cooper. We read stuff like, early novels like Evelina and things like this. Or we read a translation of Goethe, Sorrows of Young Werther. This is romantic. I'm like, this is popular stuff and it's important and we're talking about, but like, you're just missing a huge portion of the books that people actually read during the time because of sort of the cultural mimetic potential of Sorrows of Young Werther and his like yellow waistcoat and crying at the rain. It's like, doesn't this encapsulate the romantic sensibility? It's like, in some sense it does, but not the American view. Like over in America, there were people that just had a completely different set of tastes because they lived in a wilder world. They lived in the frontier where they were connected with nature because nature was killing them. They didn't live in an industrialized European city where they could walk out to the forest and remark about how beautiful the Black Forest looks and then take a carriage home at night. These are people that had, mountain lions that could eat their sheep and then they would starve.
Right.
It's a different
world.
world.
J.D. Cowan, our friend J.D. Cowan wrote The Last Fanatics, right, which is like a collection of his essays exploring kind of how that popular pulp genre tradition was suppressed by tastemakers sort of in the 60s and 70s.
Yep.
But that same model is taking place even earlier than that with regard to this kind of popular romantic work, the adventure fiction, in the 1880s and subsequent to that with, critics in England at the time, like people hanging out in the Bloomsbury set with Virginia Woolf. And so, it's that same exact pattern, right? They're just like people who have, for whatever reason, their anti-populist belief that literature has to be unreadably boring.
Yeah.
And they force that into kind of what is serious.
It's like the people reading Ulysses. Like everybody's taken some course where they had to read James Joyce. And everybody eventually gets the Cliff's Notes and realize that they've already read this story. It's called The Odyssey. There's right? So they know what happens in it. And then you get an idea, okay, why did English professors actually care about this? Oh, he wrote it in all these different styles. I'm like, okay, so it's an intellectual masturbatory exercise that we now have to read that nobody likes. This is kind of stupid, right?
I will say that the Turquoise Serpent and my soon-to-be released sequel are not intellectually masturbatory exercises. Yeah. They're fun to read. That was my prime directive writing those. I was like, this has to rip. This has to be fun, fun to read on every page.
Yeah.
So hopefully I achieve that. You'll let me know when you get around to reading it. I take no offense whatsoever. I have so many books by friends online and actual published authors that I've been struggling to read for years and still haven't gotten through. It's
hard for me to find the time. I got to schedule time for it. I usually keep a book on a table because my kids, they don't have a great sleep schedule. They'll wake up in the middle of the night and stuff. I don't know. They inherited my anti-sleep genes. Like I don't sleep that much. So I hang out with them a lot, and then I'll just read a book while they're playing or watching TV or something like that. So the book that I've been reading is called Laurus, which is a Russian book. That's the book that I'm reading right now. And so when I finish that, maybe we'll do Turquoise Serpent, just because I'll probably want something that's more, I wanted something really orthodox, and something really Russian. Sometimes you get in the mood for like Russians have this perspective that's It's different. So we'll do that one next,
Definitely.
maybe. That's just how it is. Like, I have to make sure that I just always have a book available to read. I realize I do a ton of reading. I read people's articles all the time. I do a lot of nonfiction reading. Obviously, I read the Bible, listen to the Bible. So I do a ton of reading every day, but it's not always like I'm sitting down and reading this epic fantasy novel beginning to end. I don't have time to binge read either. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Some people
Absolutely.
do that. I just don't have time to do that. I have to read like a bunch of little chunks at a time.
Well, that was what originally brought me sort of into the neo pulp sphere in the first place. I was trying to read sort of the classic mainline fantasy stuff because that's what I had grown up enjoying.
Yeah.
And I had to eventually just give up. Right. I was like, I 800 pages and there's 10 of them. I can't do this. There's no way. Like between kids and a full work schedule and just the vagaries of adult life.
What really got me about I'm gonna just say like 90s and onward fantasy, these door stoppers. There are, I would say, about 50% of the long fantasy books I've read, I actually regret reading. And I stopped and thought about this. I was like, this is a really bad batting average for like an entire category of books. I can't think of a category of book where I've read, or half of them I've completed and I regret doing it. Because they're bad. And even from authors that I normally like Brandon Sanderson. So I look at the Stormlight Archive. Okay? I haven't read the fourth book in the Stormlight Archive, despite me saying the first book in the Stormlight Archive is one of my favorite fantasy books, right? It's really good. And it's because number 2 is bad, and number 3 is so bad, it's so boring, and so long, and so cringy, that I got to the end, I'm like, I really regret spending my time on this. I could have, immediately you make the calculation of like, what else could I have done? It's like I could have read like 5 more Glenn Cook books and I would have enjoyed all of them more than I enjoyed this experience by a wide margin.
Right. Yep. I went through that with, I read the first Stormlight when it came out and enjoyed it like you. I have not gone, I think I read the first one right when it came out. And so I was waiting for the second one and just got too busy in the meantime and haven't continued. But I had that exact same experience with the Wheel of Time books and never finished that series. Just got bogged down in the 7th or 8th or something like that.
Yeah.
And the Malazan series too. It was the same thing. Somewhere around Reaper's Gale, the 7th or 8th book. I was like, you know what?
It's those. Yeah, it's the same thing. Now I will say that I think the book 7, 8. I think there's 10 Malazan books. I have to stop and think about it.
I think you're right in that central series.
Yeah, I'd
there's
say
some ancillary ones now.
After Midnight Tides, I lost a lot of interest in the story. Midnight Tides didn't have anything to do really with the main line. It was just like a different book, and I liked it so much because it was a complete story that wrapped up. And then I went on to I think it was Bone Hunters. Is it Bone Hunters after that? I don't know. And man, it just felt like it was so long. It was just trying to draw all these plot threads from previous books, and I'm like, it's just too slow. I continued on with it, but I didn't really enjoy it. I will say that you get to book 10, there's an ending, it's okay. I don't know. I like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I like the style that it's written in a lot. I like the mythology that backs it up, but I don't always like the plots.
Yeah, it's something in the mix, right? Because I picked these examples because I like both guys as writers. I like a lot of their ideas. I like a lot of what they're doing. And it just, the sheer scale, the sheer length of the books, and I guess some of the editing choices, it's just brutal. Yeah.
And just compare that to reading, and this is what I love about short fiction. Short fiction has been, it's not a lost art, but it's an art that's been de-emphasized in the literary world for a long time. But, you can get a book of Robert E. Howard stuff and read one story. You don't have to read the entire Conan book, right? It's a bunch of stories. So read a story, then read something else. Have some variety there. You're not going to get bored of Conan because you're probably just not going to read a bunch of stories right in a row. Robert Jordan, by the way, did write a Conan book. I have it somewhere.
I knew that.
It's Conan the Destroyer. So I'm trying to remember how this worked. Is that he wrote the book and then it's tied in with the movie, but it's totally different and better than the movie. It's the second Conan movie, Conan the Destroyer.
Yeah.
So
I knew there was a connection there.
Yeah,
but I didn't know what it was.
I'm not sure if it started as a novelization or he wrote the book and then they tried to adapt the movie on it. I'm not sure I don't remember the connection there, but he wrote it in like a week. He was an English teacher and wrote it over his spring break, and it just like bangs out the plot. It hits hard, you know. It goes through. It's like a very classically written novel, very good. So yeah, he did that. He knew how to write like short, to the point works. But I think once you have success, then the tendency is to indulge in that success. You lose that fire of trying to write something really good. I think we could see in George R.R. Martin as well. That first Game of Thrones book, the first Song of Ice and Fire book, Game of Thrones, it's really well done for what it is. Now, as a writer, I'm really aware of the tricks, which is that he just switches character perspectives over and over again to kind of draw out a meandering soap opera plot, but it works well. And you like the characters, or you hate them and you want to see them die, but that also works too. And then somewhere along the way, those books start to really slow down because you just lose the fire. You lose the fire to like cut things that aren't good.
Well, I know with Jordan, wasn't his wife his editor at his publisher? I think Edith or whatever her name is. I can't remember her name. But I want to say that his wife was like one of the more important and prominent fantasy editors who was working with him. So, I don't know. In some cases, maybe that would result in more getting cut. But at least in this case, it seems to have bloated his work.
Yeah, Robert Jordan's editor was his wife. And I don't think that was necessarily a good relationship as far as the output of the books. And I've made this point before, is that if you actually look at those middle books, the problem is that he splits up the group. The group gets split up into a bunch of different parties doing unrelated things. So you only get it'd be like you buy a whole novel and you get just act 1 of 5 plots, and that's the book. Well, that's really boring. But what's more boring is the next book, which is act 2 of 5 different plots.
Right.
Where everybody's standing around trying to make decisions, because that's act 2. And then finally you get the next book, you're like, well, I think this one's good. It's like, yeah, it's act 3 of 5 different plots where everything is tying up. And then it gets good.
Right. Yeah, that was like The Path of Daggers and Winter's Heart or whatever, were those really slumpy books.
Yeah, Winter's Heart is basically, and if you understand, it's 5 different or I don't know how many, but I'm just going to say 5 because it sounds like too many. It's 5 act 3s, or 5 act 2s happening. Act 2 of a book is usually the slump. It's where characters are making decisions about what they need to do. So classic 3-act structure, for those of you who are writers, you have a first act which establishes your conflict and has some exposition, tells you who the characters are, what's at stake, all that kind of stuff. Anything you need to know about the universe. Act 2 is going to be where characters are coming up against a lot of obstacles. They are on their heels. They're trying to make decisions about how they're going to solve the conflict. And then Act 3 is them attempting to solve the conflict, often having a small failure and then thinking of a way around that failure and then succeeding. So that's your standard 3-act structure. So Act 2 is literally an act where things don't happen, but characters make decisions about what's going to happen. If you have a whole book of that, it's incredibly boring because there's no plot. There's literally nothing happening. Like I think I remember one where Egwene was it? No, not Egwene. Who's the queen? Elaine?
Elaine is the queen of Camlin. Or
that's
whatever.
Right. So they're trying to decide if they're going to invade this other country. And then the book ends. They're like, we're going to do it. And then the book ends. It's like, great.
Yeah. Right, and there was I think simultaneous to that there was like the Perrin, the wolf guy plot where
Yeah.
he was like chasing his wife, and to contextualize it, he was trying to catch up to his wife who had been kidnapped for like several books, and this was like the middle of it where truly nothing was happening. Like it was unbearable. I was just it really soured my opinion of kind of like both the character and the whole project, because I was just so aggressively skipping those sections that I was like, what am I even doing this for? Like, why am I reading? I'm angry.
Yeah. So yeah, I think my point was like if they had taken those and made 4 or 5 books instead of 3, if they made like 4 or 5 books that each had a single plot, but they just dealt with one set of characters, you would have had some unsatisfied fans. Why isn't Rand in this book? Why is it just about Perrin and this eagle-nosed wench that he married for some reason that I don't like? I actually like Perrin. I do. Everyone hates him. I don't know why everyone hates that character, but I always liked him, and I liked his bitchy wife too. I think that was a portrait of Robert Jordan's real marriage.
I think so too.
So I always liked that, but yeah, fans would go, oh, I want Rand, the main guy. Rand disappears for like half the books anyway.
He got too powerful too fast. They had to like sideline him a little bit.
Yeah, that was it. That's wrong.
I say fast, but 6 books in.
Yeah, 6 books in, he's actually really strong. It's like, I gotta write like 6 more. I gotta really milk this. All right, I'm just putting up another book cover. Oh no, not my Adobe account. I don't want that. I tried to show a book cover to my people here. There we go. There's a book cover. Okay, so that's a new book. It's coming out. Yeah, so that's kind of how I feel about like Robert Jordan. If he had just written 5 kind of books with unified plots that all kind of led everybody back together, it would have been way better than trying to split everything up into 5 plots happening across the book. It just gets really annoying, and like I said, you get a bunch of Act 3s in one book or Act 2s in one book, and then it's really boring. Nothing happens.
David, by chance, have you read Guy Gabriel Kay's series, the Fionavar Tapestry? I think it's called. It has like the summer tree.
I have not.
Have you read any Gabriel Kay in general?
I haven't.
I was just curious to hear your opinion of him, because he's like highly touted, sort of as one of the more like literary straddling genre writers, and that's always such a like red flag almost to me, where somebody's writing in a way that gets them.
Oh, okay, yes, I remember this series. I didn't read it. The first book's called The Summer Tree, right? So this was like right. One of these 80s. This is one of these 80s ones, kind of like who wrote the Thomas Covenant books? I've done videos on them.
Oh yeah.
So I like the Thomas Covenant books in one way, but they're awful in another way. Oh, Stephen R. Donaldson.
That's right.
He's another one of these like kind of literary fiction kind of guys. Anyway, it's not. I haven't read it. I don't know if you read it and you have a comment about it. Sorry. Try to remember.
Well, it is. I read it a long time ago, and I tried to reread it again recently, and it really turned me off for a lot of the reasons that you may dislike or partially dislike the Thomas Covenant books, where it's, I don't know, the way that it achieves this literary element is, like, quote unquote literary element, is not just through competent prose. Like, he's a good prose writer for sure, very elegant, but at the same time, it's like always focused on this like these threads of like sexual exploitation and corruption through the sexual exploitation, where I don't know. I'm sure there's somebody out there who's written a beautiful book about that. That's like, profound and moving and really interesting to read. But every time that it like crops up in fantasy, I just find myself like, great, okay.
Yeah,
count the rapes. Like,
I read this book. I'm trying to remember what the first one was called. I think it was called Bitterwood. I don't remember the name of the author right now, but I remember the title. And I remember the second book was called Dragon Force. I'm like, well, if you have a book called Dragon Force, probably have to read it, because I love Dragon Force. And the first scene was basically like The Purge, but with rape, right? Like everybody rapes each other one night a year. I'm like, this is so stupid, right? And that's my thought. It's not offensive. It's retarded. No society can endure that. Like our entire society is built around putting sex in a specific place to serve, like to continue the human race and serve society. Not to have like, no culture that had like a rape night where everyone had to submit to sex and be raped would exist. It's more unbelievable than magic, if that makes any sense. Because like magic, It's like you give a person magic, he's still a human. If you have rape nights, it's not, you're no longer dealing with human beings anymore. They're like monsters at that point.
That's like the end of Marion Zimmer Bradley's, one of her first Darkover books.
Oh, God.
I remember it.
Yeah.
It was a Darkover Landfall, I think, where like stuff is, they're trying to like, they're human colonists who crash land on this planet, and then like minor plot stuff is happening until at the end when this like storm of psychedelic mushroom spores blows through, and then everybody goes crazy and rapes each other, and then at the end they're like, okay, well, this is our new culture now. And it just like, given what played out after that with Zimmer Bradley, you're just like, I don't know if I can stomach this anymore. Like, it's so stupid and so self-serving at the same time. Yeah,
and I actually like the Dragon Riders of Pern series by Anne McCaffrey, particularly Dragonflight, and I love the covers of them. Where's the original cover? I'm gonna find it here. Hold on. Because Michael Whalen did all these awesome dragon covers for these.
Yeah, I think I might have one somewhere around here.
Yeah,
Dragonflight.
Yeah, they're just these great images. I'm gonna pull one up here. So anyway, Dragonflight. So there is weird sex stuff in Dragonflight and in all the Dragon Riders of Pern things. Basically, people aren't married, but like men have concubines. Now, to me, that's actually believable because of the sexual dominance of men. It feels more ancient, right? Like the way that maybe ancient Mesopotamians managed like a harem of women if they were powerful. Do you know what I mean? Like it didn't seem that unbelievable, but it definitely felt fetishistic at times. Let's put it that way. Like I think you're engaging in some sort of like weird fetish by talking about this. But I still like the books because it's not emphasized. Like that's part of the background of how things work. But the emphasis is really on the plot and like the way the world works in general, not just the way that men and women work. Because like men and women are really emulating the way dragons mate, if that makes any sense. It's kind of weird.
Yeah. It does, because I mean I made like a couple threads about Zimmer Bradley on Twitter, and that generated some controversy, and people following that started like messaging me stuff like, hey, does this book have weird sex stuff? Does this book have...
Yeah.
I was like trying to tell people like, look, man, this is an extreme case. Okay, this is a very extreme case. It's not like every time an author presents you some kind of imaginary situation involving sex, I think they're like some kind of freakish pervert. It can, like you're saying with the Pern stuff, or even with some of the Gene Wolfe or Jack Vance stuff, you're like, there's a clear difference in emphasis. Like, I don't know where exactly to draw the line, but some things just have this like overwhelming ick factor, and some things don't.
Yeah. This one didn't really have a big ick factor for me. It just didn't, and it's because they didn't really emphasize the sex as like some key component. There was a big trend in the 70s and 80s. To just have more sex in fantasy, and I'm not sure where that comes from. If that was like driven out of the perverts in the fan circles, like if it's a part of the convention culture, like where it came from, or if it's just part of culture in general, because you had a bunch of people that came of age in the 60s. When they start writing, they're going to start incorporating the things that they came to believe in the 60s, which were a bunch of nonsense about free love that doesn't really work in the real world, nor did they practice it for the most part. Every hippie that I've known didn't really practice like free love or anything, because ultimately they're still human beings and they get jealous. But yeah, I think that's just something that's there. I think if you go with something more wholesome, like, I don't know, Dragonlance books, I'm not a huge fan of them now, because I don't know, they just have a style that I don't love, but they're pretty wholesome. They're not going to be full of a bunch of warped crap for the sake of having it in there. Like, what if we did Tolkien, but we put some weird sex in it? Wouldn't that be cool? There's none of that in those books.
Yeah, well, that is Tolkien with some weird sex in it is the Fiona of Our Tapestry by Guy Gabriel Kay. It's Tolkien with like accelerated weird sex and accelerated sort of like pagan nihilism. And I don't know, it just, a lot of people love it. A lot of people tout it as being sort of this, literary step toward mainstream acceptance or academic acceptance of sort of the fantasy genre. And I find Kay's stuff in general to have this flaw, even though he's a very skilled prose author and structures his stories well. Like, it's not, I don't have, my criticism, I guess, is what he's interested in rather than his skill as a writer.
Yeah, I think the subject matters a lot. What you choose to focus on is gonna make the story or break it in a lot of senses. And I think the same thing with Tolkien. Tolkien wrote beautiful prose, some of the best that you'll read. What's his focus? His focus is on these deeper themes. And that's really the difference between him and people that came after him. Saying, well, let's write Tolkien with weird sex stuff means you're discarding all the things that really made Tolkien worth reading. It's not the prose per se, it's what that prose is describing that really matters. So I guess that's my point about that. I think there's a lot of things like that. There were a lot of books like that in the 80s. There's still ones like this book, Bitterwood. I'm like, what a stupid way to try to initiate and catch the reader's attention, is with like, today we have to run and hide in the orchard because it's annual rape day. Everybody gets raped. I'm like, who thought to put this on a printing press? It's the purge, but rape.
There were a number of those kind of that came in the wake of like the broad success of the Song of Ice and Fire series and the television show. Like, I can't remember what it was called. There was one called like The Prince of Thorns too. And that one I remember putting down pretty quickly because of how aggressively it was presenting this protagonist, like as like a rapist psycho. Like it was just, there was people kept like, I would read reviews or read comments on it or whatever, and like, no, stick with it. By the third book, you're like, I understand why he's a rapist psycho. Yeah. I was like, that's not a journey that I want to go on. Like, it seems really dumb to me.
Thomas Covenant does the same thing. Really early in the book, he doesn't believe that he's like experiencing reality, and he rapes the 16-year-old girl, right? And there's huge consequences for the entire series from this decision, right? And it's a weird thing. Like, I don't really think that people want to read an entire series about the consequences of you being a rapist and like how bad you feel about that and like how awful you are. It's just not going to appeal to most people. Even though I get it, what's the point?
What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. Well, as far as I can remember, I don't think there's anything like that in my stuff. I feel I'm trying to avoid writing anything like explicitly, overtly kind of in the sexual direction like that. I don't know. It's just, it's a question of like my personal ability. Like, I'm not sure that, I'd have to try and review the results and see if it worked. But it's not something that I'm confident in, and and B, that I have any interest in developing the confidence in. I'm like, I want to titillate people with my writing. I want to get people all riled up.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't know, not for me.
Yeah, I want to tell a good story. So what is a good story? Like, what are the components of a good story? It's more than like setting, characters, plot. It's how people feel about those characters. It's how people feel about the plot. It's how people feel about the setting. Do you want them to come away from the story liking the characters and enjoying their time, or having some other experience? I don't think it's wrong to want your readers to have some other experience. That's why there's weird fiction and other things like that. There's why there's bad endings. Like, that's why I still, even though I've made a point, cyberpunk as a genre is not relevant anymore. I really enjoyed books like Snow Crash. I really enjoyed books that even had downer endings because they meant something. I like 1984. It doesn't have a happy ending. It has a different effect, right? So I guess it just depends what effect you want. And at some point, there's effects I don't want. I don't really want to read about a bunch of weird sexual perversion because that's just not part of my soul that I need to, like, titillate. I don't want to be titillated, really. Not in that way. And this is also, just an aside, people got really titillated by Game of Thrones, the show, which I found funny in the age of free pornography. It's like, oh yeah, they had like the sex scene. It's like, people like to watch the sex scenes. I'm like, that there's like infinite porn at your fingertips. But there's something about framing it, saying, oh, well, this is a place where you're not really supposed to have the sex, and we're going to show it to you. They end up really liking it, versus like opening up Pornhub and seeing like a Scooby-Doo porn parody and going like, yeah, this is, it's because it's a show on HBO. It's a fiction show, and then you see the boobs, and that's special.
It's almost like the last taboo, in the sense that, you can never, they went back in time, right? And they showed you pornography in the sort of medieval context. Yeah. And you get the like rare taboo violation of being able to go back in time to a place like that really happened, where these things were really frowned upon, and you get to observe that. Yeah. And it's like a taboo porn with a huge budget and like competent writers who I don't know, maybe it's that they gave men the sort of romance novel experience by tricking them.
Oh, this is a bigger point. Like, people are like, men don't care about romance. I'm like, men love romance. That's why, like, if you read something that's really directed towards the male market, the B story is almost always a romance.
Yeah.
Almost always.
Oh, definitely.
It's like, yeah, the A story isn't a romance. Like, the difference between a book marketed to women and a book marketed to men will be, for women, the romance is the A story and all the other stuff is B story. For men, the romance is the B story and there's something else that's an A story. It's just a matter of emphasis. Men love romance. They want to feel those feelings too. They enjoy the idea of people being attracted to each other, or attractive people matriculating a relationship. And if you're really good, you care about a character and you care about whether he ends up with the girl. You want him to end up with the girl. You can read something like Point of Impact by Stephen Hunter. It has like a great, slightly forbidden romance B story in it. That's part of what sells the book and makes the characters interesting and compelling. The romance kind of ups the stakes. The girl matters. If you have a girl that matters, well, the story's going to matter that much more too.
Definitely. All right, David. Well, hey, I gotta jump here.
All right.
So thanks. I want to thank you again for letting me come on the stream.
All right. Thanks for dropping by. You can buy Turquoise Serpent by Alexander Palacio. It's linked. I'm going to link it again one more time in the chat before we peace out here. And I might come back with another stream just to play a game or something else, depending on what's going on. I'm going to link J.D. Cowan's book. I'm going to link the book that J.D. Cowan edited with me and Brian Niemeyer, and him writing essays on Gen Y. So that's right there. That's free. You can get it on mega upload. And then I have a Gen Y book that's got some of the stuff that's in the book that J.D. Cowan edited, but a lot of other stuff too. That won't come out till November. My next fantasy book, Al Shafalda, that comes out in this month in actually 10 days. So you can pre-order the Kindle version. The paperback will go live. I'll have an email. If you're not on my email list, dvspress.com/list, and that will I'll let you know when the paperback is going to come out. I like to buy my stuff in physical form, so I like to release it all in physical form. This is technically the sequel to Crown of Sight, but it's a different story with different characters. It's a tragedy. I kind of waited to put it out for a while, so please check it out, and we'll see you all next time, I think. Anything else? All
I
right.
think that's it.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, folks. I'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.